So, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for attending this session. And thank you to the ISC for hosting this conference. We're very happy to contribute with this panel discussion. My name is Mona, and together with my colleague Francesco, we will be moderating this discussion. This is an open discussion, so please feel free to share your opinions, thoughts, and questions in the chat box and to raise your digital hands during the Q&A session. Today, we are going to explore the topic of commons as an institutional system to implement a just transition at a global and local scale, from theory to practice perspectives. As cities play a crucial role in both the environmental and climate crisis, as well as being the living place of an increasing number of humans across the world, just transitions in light of environmental justice are crucial. There's many initiatives taking place both at the global and local scale, such as the COPs or the Transition Town movement. And the needed changes call for an adaptation or a renewal of our institutional systems to better grasp the complexity of the issues ahead. So we will be asking ourselves, from a macroeconomic theory to insightful feedback on concrete case studies and a reflection on governance patterns, to what extent can commons inform new institutional makeovers for just transition? How the global and local scale inform each other? And how can the concept of commons be renewed by the interactions of multiple disciplines in a systemic approach?
So as already introduced by Mona, the issue we are going to discuss today can be tackled by a macro and a local scale, and it calls for an interdisciplinary approach. So for this reason, we have invited here to speak Gaël Giraud. Gaël is French macroeconomist. He is specialized in general equilibrium theories and resource and energy issues. He has experience in academics as well as practitioners. He was chief economist of the French Development Agency and now the director of Georgetown University Environmental Justice Program. We have Mark Swilling, a South American sociologist, specialized in governance of resources and energy, urban metabolism, and just transition. He's distinguished professor at of sustainable developments at Stellenbosch University and the co-director of the Center for Complex System in Transition. And we have Elena De Nicolis. We have seen her during the keynotes speech. She is an Italian researcher specialized in urban commons, associated at Lewis Rome, and the part of LabGov. So to introduce the discussion, I would like to give the floor to Gaël Giraud. So Gaël, you over your career, you mobilized the concept of commons as a policy tool for territorial development. We would like to ask you how you arrived to argue for this implementation of this theory, and what the theory can bring on the field.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it. Yes. So let me put it this way. Yeah, maybe a way to start is to look at this graph, which is very simple actually. The x-axis is the, I'm sorry, it's in French. I don't have time to translate it into English. It's the HDI, so Human Development Index. And each point is a country. And the y-axis is the ecological footprint, which might not be the best measure of, the ecological pressure, but it's a way to measure it. Here you have 0.8 because the HDI is always located between 0 and 1. And everybody agrees that, above 0.8, it's good. I mean, it's 0.8 is the HDI of Russia. So you are in a comfortable society if you are above this. And here you have the carrying capacity of the planet in 2012. This was in 1961. Of course, the more we destroy ecosystems, the lower goes this line, the carrying capacity. So the main point would be what is an ecologically sustainable and comfortable, let's say, quote unquote, society. It's a society that should be in this square. And as you see, this is empty. And here you have mainly poor countries, and here you have mainly wealthy countries. So this is a way to say the just transition is transition where everybody has to move. Those countries have to move in this direction. That is, they have to increase the HDI without increasing the ecological footprint. And those countries have to do exactly the opposite. They have to go in this direction. That is, they have to decrease the ecological footprint without decreasing the HDI. And of course, there is one dimension which is missing here, because a couple of years ago, there was one country which was exactly on the H here, 0.8 as an HDI and exactly 1 ecological footprint, which was Cuba. Now Cuba is here. But Cuba is hardly seen as a model because of human rights and democracy. So actually, I should rephrase everything I said. A just transition should be a transition such that you move from here to here, these countries move from here to here, and doing this, we have to do it in such a way that everybody keeps democracy or even foster democracy and human rights at least. So this is the way I would try to understand in the next minutes, just transitions. Now, commons enter the picture in a way that is, if you take the conventional viewpoint, then there is an analysis by John Romer, who is a colleague of mine at Yale, who tries to overcome from a purely neoclassical viewpoint the mistake of the tragedy of the commons by Garrett Hardin. So he tries to show that if you modify a little bit the concept of a Nash equilibrium in game theory, then you can implement actually common resource pool, commonly pooled resources in the sense of Elinor Ostrom. To show this and to understand this, just look at this prisoner's dilemma, which is very, very famous and very simple. So you have two players, they can either cooperate or defect, and this is the payment they get. And as you know, the unique Nash equilibrium is here, it's 1-1, even though obviously 2-2 would be much better. Why? Because if you agree to play any of the alternatives to this one, which is defect, then someone has an incentive to deviate unilaterally. Now, the idea of John Romer is to say, well, you know, the Nash equilibrium concept is just stupid. Because actually, in many situations, what we play is a Kantian equilibrium, where you don't check the stability of an agreement, like an equilibrium, against any type of deviation, but against any type of deviation that would be profitable, even though everybody might deviate in the same way as you are, which is not exactly the same. So let me just take an example in the theater. Suppose you are behind someone who is very tall and you don't see the scene. You could, of course, stand up and try to see above, you know, the person who is above you. But then if everybody does it, you're not in a better situation. You won't see the scene either. So that's the difference between a Nash equilibrium and a Kantian equilibrium. The Kantian equilibrium is such that if you know that if you deviate from the equilibrium strategy, and if everybody does it as well, deviates in the same way, then your payment does not increase, then you don't do it. You don't deviate this way. And this, as shown by John Romer, is a way to understand how to implement commons. Now, if you think a little bit from the philosophical viewpoint on this, you remember that, I mean, John Romer calls this the Kantian equilibrium because of Kant's categorical imperative. That is, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that this maxim should become a universal law, you know. This has been reinterpreted by Paul Ricoeur, a French philosopher, as an equivalent to the golden rule. Do to others what you want them to do to you. And this again has been reinterpreted by Christophe Theobald, a French philosopher and theologian, as dare to take another's place without leaving your own. So actually, to play a Kantian equilibrium, and in other words, to implement commons, we all have to enter into a deliberation, collective negotiation, where we all have to make this experience, which is a very deep going experience, where I have to dare to take another's place without leaving my own place. Actually, this is the way I entered into the commons at the French Development Agency, where we have promoted a number of experiences dealing with commons. The most successful one probably is water. How do you manage water? So we have a number of projects like in Kinshasa, but also in Bolivia, etc., where we have organized a community of people, essentially women, because they are much more efficient when dealing with commons, who take care of the water and the water pump, the source of water, as a commons. So the city is not the owner, no individual is the owner of the pump, but the community is taking care of it and using it as a commons. And it turns out that this is much more efficient in terms of water management than both privatization and municipalization. The example being what happened in La Paz, Bolivia, in 2016. La Paz went through the day zero, that is the day where you don't have water on tap anymore. So people in the center of the city, wealthy people, were in a very, very tragic situation, whereas poor people in the suburbs had organized themselves dealing with the water as a commons, and they kept water during the dry season, whereas wealthy people in the city didn't have water anymore. So it's just an example. Another example is a project that we had in Brazil, in Curitiba, southwest of Brazil, where we have funded a project which consists in rehabilitating a river which crosses the city as an ecological hotspot that is of which people take care as a commons. So nobody, I mean, even not the city is the owner of the river, but all the people living in the city know that they have to take care of it as a commons, and it has become a beautiful place where everybody gather in the evening, etc., etc. And of course, it's an example of urban biodiversity. Another example that we have promoted is the Fab Labs in West Africa, where, as you know, I mean, people enter into these Fab Labs and try to share wisdom and cleverness and intelligence as a commons. And this is also very successful in Western Africa. Another example, which is much more ambiguous and ambivalent, is the Kanaji Dam in Niger, where a number of people had to be expropriated because of this dam. And so we have tried to reduce the cost and the pain and the suffering of people by organizing a negotiation table where even the autochthonous population could discuss with the big companies about this dam and the way it could be constructed and built in such a way that at the end of the day, roughly speaking, the project could slowly become a commons. I'm not claiming this was successful, but at least we tried to do that. And maybe the last example is something that has not been funded by the French Development Agency, but that I discovered at this time, which is maybe the most beautiful example of a commons at the international level, at least I know, DNDI, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, which is a platform in Geneva, Switzerland, which put together people from Big Pharma, the private sector, sovereign states, and NGOs, which try to produce therapies against diseases which are neglected by the private sector because there is no solvent demand for this type of therapies. One famous example is the hepatitis C in Egypt. Hepatitis C, I mean, is ravaging Egypt today, and DNDI is providing the therapy for something like $300, whereas it costs 2,000 or 3,000 euros in Europe. Now, the next point I want to mention, and I will stop there, is the way we could interpret and try to analyze the place of the commons from a thermodynamical viewpoint. The starting point is to observe that actually our cities, our economies, our countries are very energy dependent. So in this graph, you see here the energy consumption at the world level. And here you have the real GDP still at the world level. And each point is a date. So it starts in 1960 and ends up shortly after 2010. The surprising thing is that you have an almost perfect line, which means in 2010, you need to increase by the same amount your energy consumption in order to increase the world GDP by $1, as you did in 1960. So this shows that actually, just increasing GDP is highly dependent upon the quantity of energy you can consume. Now, starting from this, you can say, well, actually, an economy, but also a city, is nothing but a big dissipative structure in the sense of Prigozhin. And I also mentioned here Georges Kouragan, who probably was one of the first guys in the 70s saying that, actually economics should be part of thermodynamics. How do you do this? You just realize that everything on Earth takes place thanks to the solar energy, which creates biomass, natural resources. The economic system, you can think of a city, is a big metabolism which extracts energy and materials and which produces some work, let's say the conference to which we are taking part now, and which exudes some waste. So degraded energy, degraded materials. Maybe part of it is recycled when we are fortunate enough to have a recycling process. And then, of course, there is a part of this energy which goes back to the universe. So in other words, maybe we should think of a city as an out of equilibrium structure which absorbs continuously energy and matter, which metabolizes it to do some useful work, to maybe complexify its structure, its laws, its rules, etc., and then which exudes some waste. It turns out that there is a physicist whose name is Bob Ayres, who has proposed a number of years ago a generalization of work, which is a physical measure of the work that is done by a city or a country. So you can think of course, the mechanical work, but also electric work, etc., etc. So here you have some time series where you see for the US, the UK, Japan, the evolution of the useful work of these countries from 1950 to 2000. And it turns out that, of course, the dependence upon, let's say, oil, here it's oil, is very high, and it should not be a surprise because it's already the case for GDP. So we could say a city is a big metabolism which extracts energy and matter, produces some work in the sense of useful work, complexifies its structure, and exudes some waste. Now the question is the structure. When I say complexify its structure, how does a city do this? It seems to me, given the fact that we are all transiting towards renewable energy-based societies, there are at least two main paradigms. The first one is a quite decentralized society where everybody is able to produce its own energy in his garden, let's say. And this is probably the paradigm that a number of activists in Germany have in mind. So in Germany, as you know, there is a big success of cooperatives to produce energy in a quite decentralized way. But unfortunately, there is also an alternative paradigm, which is exactly the opposite, where you would have a quite centralized state, maybe an authoritarian state linked to private capital, which would take care of the investment needed for green infrastructures. The reason I'm saying that is that the capex, that is the cost of capital in renewable energies, is much higher than in standard fossil fuel-based energies. For instance, for coal plant, it's between 12 and 19%, while for both nuclear, wind power, small hydraulic, photovoltaic, it's more than 40%. In other words, an economy or society based on renewable energies is much more capitalistic, paradoxically enough, than in a society based on fossil fuels. And then the question is, towards in which direction are we moving, and where does the commons play a role in this story? Obviously, the commons are moving towards the first direction, that is a quite decentralized society, but they are not the unique way to proceed. So one way to measure it, still remaining inside the framework of thermodynamics, maybe, and this is still work in progress, to which Francesco and Mona have contributed, is maybe to use Chesson's ratio. This ratio is a way to capture the complexity of an organism, metabolism, and we might think of using it as a way to capture the complexity of a city. This ratio is very simple. It's just the quantity of energy you consume per unit of time, let's say per second, per hour, per year, divided by the mass of your organism, the weight of infrastructures. So if you have a huge mass and a small flow of energy, this ratio will be very small, but it means you're not a very complex body. You're not a very complex metabolism. While if you can dissipate a lot of energy with a small mass, this suggests that you are a very complex body with a lot of structure inside yourself. In other words, you have a very low internal entropy. So here there are a number of Chesson's ratio that Chesson has computed for a number of metabolisms, let's say birds and mammals, etc. So birds seem to be on the top of this hierarchy. They are the most complex animals he studied here, probably because they have to fly. So they live in a three-dimensional world, whereas we as human beings, we live mostly in a two-dimensional world. But you can also compute this ratio for machines, And here you see also that jet aircrafts are on the top of this hierarchy. So we can also compute it for cities. Chesson did it. And we are working with Mona and Francesco for the time being in order to check whether we could have some meaningful figures. Now, the point is that if you take this seriously into account, then first of all, you see that the rebound effect that all the cities are facing, which is the fact that if you make some progress in terms of the efficiency of the use of energy, then very often you lose the gain that should be associated to this progress because you invent new ways to dissipate energy. Then this is our addiction to energy dissipation. In other words, we are addicted to this numerator, whereas we fear that the energy shift and the energy transition might reduce this, while what we have to do actually is to keep the complexity and to reduce both the numerator and the denominator. Why should we keep the complexity? Because reducing the complexity, it's easy. That's dictatorship. And that's exactly the story that was told by Karl Polanyi at the end of the 30s, early 40s. That is, you know, when the situation is, when people are desocialized in a society, then they call for a strong dictatorial solution. Now, it might be the case that the complexity, be it captured by Chesson ratio or any other measure, might be the true secret of a prosperous city. That is, the more complex our social relationships, the more prosperous it is, the more interesting it is, the more exciting it is. Then the question we could ask is, do commons enable to reduce both the quantity of energy we are dissipating and the weight, the mass of infrastructures without reducing complexity? So I don't have the answer so far, but I do believe this is a very interesting programmatic research question. And then probably there is an additional question, which is probably so far we have just considered complexity in a very crude way. There might be a good versus a bad complexity, which means probably we have to refine our tools, even our measuring tools, in order to capture more precisely the type of complexity that makes life exciting. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Gael, for this insightful presentation and the case studies you've shared with us from the AFD, as well as the philosophical perspective you gave on how to place ourselves when dealing with commons. And your part on urban metabolism and complexity really links with the work of Mark. So Mark, you've been working extensively on urban metabolism. You've published a report called The Weight of Cities for the UN. And linking this work on urban metabolism and commons, as Gael just did, maybe from your understanding of the commons and the way you phrase it in your last book, The Age of Sustainability, where you frame them as analytical tools and you consider governance conditions for commons to achieve a just ecological transition. We were wondering how you made the link between urban metabolism and urban commons and how it echoed with your conception of justice. And from your experience, how commons can be used to implement this ecological transition in terms of governance.
Thank you very much. I'm going to really just launch off two major reports that I've been involved in the last 2 or 3 years. The one is, as you say, The Weight of Cities, Resource Implications of Future Urbanization, which was together with an international team. We compiled this report with the International Resource Panel, which really was the first attempt to quantify the urban metabolic implications of future urbanization, which is premised on the assumption that the total urban population is going to double in the 4 decades, 2010 to 2050. And the second report, together with some colleagues, it was really was commissioned by the high-level panel on the oceans and published, and a summary was published in Nature. And it was called a transition to sustainable ocean governance, which used the commons idea more specifically. what really struck me when we finished this report on the weight of cities is that basically what we were able to show is that if the urban population doubles, the total urban metabolic consumption is going to more than double, from about 40 billion tons per annum in 2010 to 90 billion tons by 2050. And that would be complemented by the continuation of sprawl under business as usual conditions. So cities basically occupy about a million square kilometers, and business as usual basically means that that's going to go up to 2.5 million, and that's going to penetrate into the most productive agricultural areas which are surrounding our cities. And so the obvious conclusion is business as usual means unsustainable cities, which will also blow the fuses of the planet. And so we have to change. At that stage, I wasn't working with a conception of the commons, but it troubled me. How are we going to think about this change? And at the last chapter, what we were able to include, which is unusual for a UN panel, is a conception of governance, which I now think of as collaboratory governance, which I'll explain. So it was really out of this work where, following exactly Gail's way of thinking, although I didn't know Gail at the time, is to kind of begin to see cities as dissipative structures, where the increasing growth of complexity of urban systems was really to hold exergy. I prefer to use the word concept of exergy, which in turn results in the growth of entropy in the systems that are being cannibalized by the urban systems. But how to think of transformation in a short space of time that is not statist became the problem statement. And what's interesting about when you start seeing cities as flows of metabolic resources from environmental systems through urban systems and back into environmental systems, is that those flows are originated in the commons, get translated into private ownership systems, and therefore expropriated for the few in urban systems, and then spat out back into the commons, which is climate change and so on and so forth. And so how do we think of dissipative structures without reducing complexity in a way that results in greater justice? And two bodies of work since then came together in my latest book, The Age of Sustainability, which is subtitled Just Transitions in a Complex World. Two bodies of literature came together. The one is the new literature on relational governance. So if you read somebody like Bob Jessup from Lancaster University, whose latest book is called The State, Past, Present, and Future, he basically, his point of departure is the state doesn't exist. What exists is the state as a political idea. What exists in practice is a ramshackle affair, and an ensemble of a multiplicity of different institutions, most of whom hardly ever align with one another. But since the 1970s, we've seen a shift from government to governance. And that was really associated with the neoliberal revolution and the weakening of the political center and the state. So as we have the weakening from the 1970s onwards, the weakening of a political center, weakening of the state, we have rising complexity, increasingly serious crises. And by the 2000s, we need greater levels of directionality if we're going to address our challenges. But how do you do directionality under complexity? And that becomes the core challenge that the relational governance community is addressing. Yeah, sure, you can hark back to, you can call for social democracy 2.0, socialism 2.0, which is essentially about bringing the state back in a traditional way, which means reducing complexity. And that's probably only achievable in an authoritarian way. And in South Africa, this is what's happening to us at the moment. But the alternative is to say, well, there are examples at city level, especially, but also in other places, where there are political coalitions emerging and saying, bring the state in a non-statist way. And that gives rise to what Bob Jessup refers to as the governance of governance, or the term that he uses, collaboratory governance. And what this means is the emergence of a new capability within statecraft, which is the capacity to facilitate partnering. And once you start thinking in terms of directionality, not in terms of statist imposition, but the facilitation of partnering for directionality amongst a multiplicity of institutions, state and non-state actors, then you start building a new conception of governance. So that's a key part of the story. However, the other part of the story is the commons. For me, if you take that point of departure of seeing the city as metabolic flows which originate in the commons, how do we start thinking about the reduction of the power of ownership as a way of expropriating exergy for the benefit of the few? And that's where I think what this conference is all about, the incredible spread of a vast multiplicity of commons-based peer-to-peer systems that are not statist, are not market-oriented, but not exclusion of both, that are giving rise to the accumulation of knowledge resources which are shared, which are then downloadable and accessible by a multiplicity of users. And that can take place in energy cooperatives, can take place in many community-based type structures that we see in African cities, and many other different forms. So, but what I became increasingly concerned about in the commons literature is an anti-statism, a kind of belief that the commons, in a sense, on its own, is going to somehow replace both the state and the market. And I think that is a recipe for the ghettoization or nicheization of the commons. So just as the state over the last 500 years or so has enabled the legal and financial framing for the emergence of capitalism, we basically need to, following the work of Bowens and others, we basically need to start thinking of the kinds of collaboratory governance institutional framings that create frameworks for and enable the emergence of the commons. And I think once we start bringing these two literatures together on relational governance, on commons-based P2P or peer-to-peer systems and institutionalization, and we start kind of aligning these ways of thinking, what we end up with is a way of dealing with the challenges in African cities and cities in general, which does not rely on the reduction of complexity, but builds a new capability for facilitating the kinds of relational institutionalism that is going to be necessary for the flourishing of the commons. So this is, it's quite, given the short space of time, it's quite conceptual, but in the report we did for the high-level panel on the oceans, we tried to operationalize that, to try and conceptualize, what is the ocean is a natural commons, but how do you build a knowledge commons that makes it possible to start dealing with the challenge of the high seas, which is not governed by anybody, without having to build a global status type institution to kind of police in a top-down way what is unpoliceable. So that I'll stop there with those kinds of more kind of provocative thoughts, which surprisingly, Gael and I never rehearsed this. We never do, but our thinking always completely aligns.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for having bring in the discussion the topic of relational governance and directionality. And I will start from here asking Elena to intervene. So with LabGov, you have done extensive work on the implementation of commons in urban areas. And I was wondering whether you can expand on some results you have gathered until now, and especially on the conditions, governance conditions you have identified to make the implementation of commons effective, most importantly. Thank you.
Thank you, and please let me know if you can see my slide safely.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I'm so sorry I can't. Okay, very good. So yes, thank you, Francesco, Mona, Gael, and Mark. And I'm just going to complement what both Gael and Mark said about cities and how they can maybe represent a terrain to experiment some of the governance conditions for a just transition to happen. So as both Gael and Mark already explained, the situation at the city level is still very experimental. So we can see a lot of fragmentation, and many cities are experimenting different strategies, and there is really the need for to build a comparable and interoperable set of concepts and tools. This is true not just at the policy level, because cities need to standardize their actions to maybe also activate some forms of collective action. As we all know that Elinor Ostrom herself addressed collective action as one of the only way to cope with climate change, so with the biggest sustainability issue at the global level. But the fragmentation is not real only at the policy level, it's also at the scholarly level. So there are really many definitions of urban commons, and several scholars developed their own. So this is just to say where we started. We started from, so we realized that we needed a definition of urban commons that could encompass different scholarship traditions and maybe represent the conceptual umbrella through which lenses analyze the cases. What we were observing, especially in the Italian national situation, because starting in 2011, several Italian cities started to experiment with urban commons inspired regulations, or to better say, city regulations that would directly enable the creation of urban commons. Later, few years later, also the national level, so the law, arrived as well. And we have now several attempts, sometimes, so some norms are at the level of the Code of Public Contracts, so in public tendering, but then we also have other norms related to social partnerships and other forms of legal tools that can enable governance conditions to happen at the local level for the commons. But before that, cities started to experiment with the tools that they had at hand. I'm going to focus on and we decided to start analyzing them, also because we at LabGov were promoting applied experimentation in these cities, sometimes working with the cities directly, other times starting from the university level as action research. I said this a little bit in the panel this morning, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But since what we tried to do was to build a research project grounded in empirical analysis on one side and action research and applied experimentations on the other. But the first step was really to navigate of the commons conceptualization. So here are some of the definitions that we used. Of course, Erin Ostron's collectively governed resources, Carol Rowe's Comedy of the Commons, constructed commons and infrastructure commons, as Brett Fishman analyzed them. And finally, the group of scholars that focus on the politics and on the conflictual side of the commons. I just mentioned David Harvey, but there are many others. So really, I'm so sorry, I can't, my screen is frozen. I'm very sorry. I don't know what's happening.
Maybe you can quit the full screen if it's possible. And then...
Okay, because my connection was, okay, it's happening all at the same time. Very good. So sorry. I'm so sorry, I don't know what's happening. Okay. This is really frustrating. I'm very sorry.
No worries. Maybe you can cut the video so that it has more.
Just press once, so they'll get there.
Oh, we lost Elena. Elena, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you right now, it seems, but it's probably my connection jumped.
If you want, you can cut your video so that we at least can hear you and see your slides. Okay.
I can't hear anything. Okay, I'm gone.
Perfect. Now we can hear you.
Okay, very good. So now you can hear me. I'm so sorry. It seems like I can't do anything. I'm very sorry. I'm just trying to figure out what to do. Apologies again.
No worries. From here we can see your slides. If you want, you can let them in display like this. We're saying the
Okay.
6th one.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Sorry, but I just had my screen completely frozen, so I had no idea what you were looking at. So sorry about that. So again, our analysis was based both on empirical and then on applied projects. So again, we reviewed this literature and we eventually came out with a normative conceptualization of the city as a common source city that could guide both the empirical and the applied research analysis. So this morning's presentation, Sheila Foster already talked about the work that her and Christian Iaione did on this concept of city as a commons. So I'm not going to spend more words on this, but this was just to give you an example. So we basically try to look for a normative conceptualization of the urban commons and the city as a commons that could be applied to all these urban experimentation, that could help us understand these urban experimentations that were happening in Italian cities from the lens of analysis grounded in both the legal side and the policy side. So we started with the case of Bologna because it was the first city that we worked on, and it was the first city that at the European level promoted a policy expressly so targeted, labeled as a policy of the urban commons. We later realized that it was not indeed the first city to promote a city regulation on the urban commons, but it was the first labeled as such. It created it had a huge impact in the Italian context because more than 200 cities, after the big success of Bologna, implemented, or maybe we critically analyzed that as a copy and paste situation, because more than 200 cities basically implemented the Bologna regulation, it's now called, as an attempt. So in some cases, it's a genuine attempt to promote citizen participation and to promote innovative governance of the urban commons when they can't, they don't have the resources to do it themselves, or they want to innovate with a genuine attempt to do so. In other cases, it's more an exploitation of the word urban commons and its political meaning for a variety of reasons. So we decided it was worth worth analyzing. So the regulation for the urban commons that Bologna implemented in 2014 produced, so it's based on this central regulatory tool, which is the Pact of Collaboration, that it was not at the time recognized by the legal framework at the national level, so it was sort of a legal tool invented, created, and a democratic innovation produced by the city, and it's a pact where the city and one actor or more than one actor, if it's a co-governance pact, so let's say the city, one NGO, a group of informally organized residents, a school, a university, a private foundation, a company, or any kind of actor share duties and responsibility for a project of regeneration of an urban commons. Said urban commons can be a city-owned building, a privately owned building, a street, an infrastructure, or even a service. The city of Bologna produced by now, so today, more than 500 pacts of collaboration. At the time that we started the analysis, so we analyzed the first 2 years of this is a map of the distribution of the pacts of collaboration across the city. At the time we conducted the analysis, we analyzed the 280 pacts of collaboration. So in the first 2 years, they analyzed the 280 pacts of collaboration. Just one note, before implementing the regulation itself, the city conducted 3 on-field experimentations in 3 representative urban commons in 3 complex neighborhoods. Again, the results that I'm going to show are based on the analysis of these 200 collaboration pacts. So what we did was analyzing the policy documents, so the text of the pacts. We also conducted a survey. We sent the survey to the civic signatories of the pacts, so all the NGOs or anyone who was, involved in the pact of collaboration. And then, of course, we carried out in-depth interviews and focus groups with a sample group of respondents, and of course, as well as the policymakers involved in the implementation of the regulation. So I'm not going to show you the graphs, and because we don't have much time, but I just wanted to focus on the results. So the open challenges and scope for improvement that we identified. First of all, diversity and inclusiveness. The reference of the pacts were born almost exclusively in Italy. Some of them were from other countries, but they were a minority. 62% of the pacts respondents were born and based in Bologna, and this social centrality, as we defined it, is confirmed also by their level of education. So 59% of them, they did indeed go to college, and they had a degree, even a specialized degree. Among the reference of the pacts, 74% of them were employed full-time or part-time. There was a rather limited amount of pensioners. They were predominantly men, and they were employed mostly in the NGO sector and to a lesser extent in the private, so they were working for a private company. Despite being outnumbered, women represented a wider variety of organizational backgrounds. So they came from companies, NGOs, institutions, universities, and as well as informal groups. So one first thing we realized is that the pact did not achieve a level of diversity and inclusiveness that is actually, that could situate the social composition of the city of Bologna, which is a very diverse and multicultural city. So this is the first challenge we identified. Second, and this is more open this is probably more a scope of improvement, the regulation implementation, the first implementation phase did promote social capital bonding, but not bridging. So basically, the paths of collaboration did not create new social networks or new networks that could bring toward the paths towards professional opportunities, jobs creation. They basically already knew themselves, so they bonded together, and their collaboration mechanism, of course, they were improved, but the creation of new bonds was lacking, sort of. Then we still we identified still obstacles in terms of procedural and administrative bottlenecks, and there is a lack of development of a proper public-private community partnerships. So the majority of the paths of collaboration are bilateral. By bilateral, we mean that they were signed by the city and one single NGO. So the power was still in the hands of the city. Co-governance pacts, as we define them, so pacts where you have a variety of social stakeholders and the city, they were basically absent. There was just a handful of them. Moving to the other case that I wanted to show you, it's the case of Naples. Naples implemented a model based on the recognition of, yes, Mona, I'm out of time,
just
right?
Just 5 minutes of
I'm
questions.
just gonna wrap it up.
Thank you. Elena?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. So Naples implemented a model based on the recognition of civic uses of the urban commons. So they decided to implement a model where they just recognized what was already existing, and they left everything to the self-organization of communities. So we identified in this model the scope of improvement based on sustainability. So what's lacking here, and what the city is working on right now, is the economic sustainability of the urban commons. Finally, the city of Turin implemented the regulation as well, so starting from the Bologna model, but they applied to to funding from the structural funds of the European Union, the Urban Innovative Action. So they decided to invest in a very complex policy program, and the paths of collaboration, they implement complex urban regeneration process. So they are working on the self-sustainability of the urban commons. So they are regenerating complex facilities, as in Naples, city-owned buildings or former factories, and they're creating structures, co-working spaces, workshop labs, fab labs, social restaurants, where the communities involved can indeed create mechanisms they can create opportunities for circular economy, sustainability mechanisms. Basically, they can improve they can create opportunities for social entrepreneurship for themselves. Finally, and I'm going to close on this note, the city of Turin understood the importance of not relying upon one single legal tool. They created a set of legal tools. I'm mentioning some of them: the Foundation for the Commons, the Civic and Collective Management Model, the Shared Management Model. So they understood that one single legal tool cannot be the panacea to solve every issue, but you need to provide the city with a flexible set of legal tools that they can choose from, they can pick depending on the neighborhoods, on the community, on the specific situation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you, yes, for presenting this
for
very
the attention
insightful.
And
oh, sorry. Elena, are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you.
Okay. So thank you very much for this insightful intervention.
So sorry for my connection.
And presenting this very.
So sorry.
No worries. I don't know if you can hear us, but so we have 3 minutes left. So if anyone has a question, it's the moment to raise your hands or put it on the chat box. If there are no questions, we can see that there's a link between the 3 interventions today, which we can say that is the concept of urban metabolism in a way, so considering the city in its complexity. The last point of Elena, the fact that commons can enable circular economy, can definitely enrich the exergy that Mark was talking about. So high quality, useful work that cities consume. And echoed the macro perspective that Gaël presented, and the Chiasson ratio that can provide a very interesting tool to assess how commons can interact in the urban metabolism, and can be an informative tool for a just transition at the city level. So
if I can make a comment, Mona,
yeah, of course,
make
Gaël,
a comment
go ahead.
on what Mark and Elena said. It seems to me, I don't know whether you would agree on that, Mark and Elena, that during many years, at least this was my impression, many scholars have focused on commons as a new type of ownership, saying it's not public ownership, it's not private ownership, etc. And actually, both what you said, Mark, about the collaboratory governance and the way the state has to enter into a new type of conversation with a number of actors in the society, and what Elena at the end just said about the flexible legal tools that we need to make it possible to have commons in the city, this suggests to me that the main question is not so much ownership as a new way to enter into a multilateral conversation inside the city. What would you say about that?
You have exactly 30 seconds each to do this, to answer this useful question.
Yeah, I think my answer would be it's context specific. So in the South African context, 90% of all assets are owned by less than 10% of the population. 80% of the population own nothing. And so land redistribution, especially urban land redistribution, is critical for a just transition in the South African context. So I don't think one can get away from a fundamental redistribution. The question is how that's done. So for many years in my life, I've supported land invasions, urban land invasions. And those are the most effective ways to redistribute land. It doesn't happen through the state.
Elena? So I see that there's a break just after this session. I don't know, Karen, if we get the chance to stay 5 more minutes here. I know Gaël needs to leave right now.
So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaël, for
Bye-bye.
participating today and your insightful intervention.
Right. See you soon.
See you.
If people are interested to stay a few extra minutes, that's fine.
Okay, well, maybe we will conclude.
Yeah, I guess Elena, we lost her, so maybe we can just close it, and we can re-put the questions in the meeting room that's the organizer organized. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for being here.
Thank you.